This is Guy Burgess. With this post, I'd like to introduce you to an upcoming series of posts which will apply conflict mapping ideas to the authoritarian populism problem. Now, as you may remember from earlier posts, we have been outlining a strategy which we call massively parallel peacebuilding, which we see as the best way of trying to get a handle on very large scale, very intractable, very complex problems. And as you may remember also, massively parallel peacebuilding is built around 10 key challenges. And the first of these challenges is just to simply figure out what's going on. And what I want to do with this post is introduce you to actually a series of posts which will try to explain how various types of conflict mapping can help you understand the authoritarian populism problem. Now, to start with, I want to emphasize the idea that mapping in some form, you could call it a conflict assessment, is essential. If you don't know your way around, you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble one way or another. Now, take this forest fire, for example. If you don't know where the fire is, and you don't know where the roads are, you don't know what the wind is, you can quickly find yourself in all sorts of trouble. So what we want to try to do is to outline how some different ways of looking at the conflict problem that'll give you the same kind of critical information that a good map of a forest fire would give you. I also want to borrow another idea from the forest fire fighting community. They have this notion of a fire complex, which is actually a series of fires that are close enough together and they're feeding off one another. This is a map of the Mendocino complex, which has been in the news this summer out in California. Now, the authoritarian populism problem can best be thought of as a conflict complex. That is a whole series of conflicts interacting in all sorts of complicated ways. Now, to understand this, a certain amount of it you can get with geospatial mapping, where you try to put things on a map, as they've done with the Fragile States Index, or as lots of folks have done trying to analyze the election returns in the United States. But conflict mapping is more than that. It's your worldview image. And right now, both the left and the right in the United States, and I suspect a lot of other countries, have a pretty simple worldview. They're the good guys, and the other guys are just evil. And that doesn't give you enough understanding of the problem to be able to sensibly try to address it. So in past posts, we've introduced a number of different ways where you can try to map things. This post talked about thinking about things in terms of a conflict between the coexisters or the compromisers who want to reach some sort of an accommodation in the conflict, between those who want to fight on for victory, and then there are the divide and conquer types who want to exploit the conflict for selfish gain. And these are very different ways of thinking about a conflict than the traditional left versus right, side A versus side B. And I think there's a lot of value in that. Anyway, there's a related post that you might want to look at. And in another earlier post, we developed the notion of this three-dimensional space, where at one apex you have democracy, at another autocracy or tyranny, and at another one anocracy or anarchy. And you can place societies at various times in that space. And what we're trying to do with this whole project is help push societies away from autocracy and anocracy and toward democracy and an ideal democracy. So that's another way of trying to map some of these ideas. Now, in this upcoming series of posts, we're going to try a couple of other ideas as well. One, we want to explore this distinction between democracy and authoritarianism and actually lay out a continuum on a number of different dimensions where societies can fall either close to the democracy end of the continuum or something a lot closer to authoritarianism and plutocracy. So that's going to be one upcoming post. Another couple of posts are going to get at this critical problem of who's fighting who over what. If you don't understand that, you're in a lot of trouble. And in a sense, this is sort of a good version of the human terrain mapping that was so controversial, for good reason, in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. If you don't understand from a sociological, anthropological, psychological, economic point of view the nature of the conflict and who's fighting who over what, you're going to run into a lot of trouble. So in this context, we're going to have one post on the culture wars. We call it the red-blue culture divide. And it's going to look at the conflict between conservative cultural beliefs, which we'll explore in a great deal of more detail, and liberal cultural beliefs, and try to look at not only what the two sides believe in, but the underlying social dynamics that take us to that position, and what kind of accommodations might be possible. There's going to be another slideshow on what we call the purple-gold distributional divide. And this is going to look at things from a different dimension. To start with, we look at one extreme, the folks with the gold, the very, very rich, and then everybody else at the other extreme, and that includes both liberals and conservatives on the cultural dimension, which is why we call it the purple divide. And we're going to look at tensions between four principal groups. One group is the 0.01%, the 1% of the 1%, who have been getting most of the, well, they've enjoyed the most spectacular increase in wealth over the last few decades at the expense of everybody else in one way or another. So that's one group. Another group is sort of a step down. This is, you might call it the cosmopolitan elite. You might call it the meritocracy. Some folks call it the top 9.9%, that everybody who's sort of in the upper echelons, but not the super rich. Some folks focus on the top quintile. But this is a group of folks who are very successful, often in the professions. Their kids enjoy a lot of advantages, like much better access to higher education, for example. And these folks are resented by the folks who are not doing so well on the distributional ladder. And this includes you might call them the protected classes. These are the various groups that Democrats have championed over recent decades: racial minorities, the LGBTQ community, feminists, immigrants, and folks with disabilities. And then you have another group, a group that's more championed by Republicans and conservatives. So sometimes they're called the left behind. These are the folks that I call them the protected from classes, because they're the folks that progressives want to protect their constituents from. This includes white working class men who, at least according to the accusations and the stereotypes and the images, are more racist and more sexist, and traditional women who tend not to be so supportive of feminist goals. So you've got that. And then there's going to be, so we've got the two dimensions. We've got the cultural dimension and the distributional dimension. Then in yet another post, we're going to look at red, blue, gold interactions. So we're going to put this on a three-dimensional space. So on one dimension, you've got the culture divide across the bottom, horizontally, and then vertically, you have the social hierarchy from purple to gold. And so then you can slice this up in a variety of ways, with the top 1% of the 1% at the very top, and work your way down. You can also slice it vertically and look at the cultural divide, and you sort of overlay these on top of it. And then there's another way of looking at this, and this is what's critical to this whole authoritarian threat idea, which is central. Back up here for a second. The folks at the lower end of the social hierarchy, the left behind and the protected classes, are the folks who are very distrustful of the elites, for pretty good reasons. And this is the energy behind the populist revolts on both the left and the right. So part of what feeds into understanding authoritarian populism is to understand why the left behind and the protected classes, or whatever you want to call them, are so resentful of the elites and why the elites have lost their trust. But that's only part of the problem. Now, going back, the other part is that you've got the authoritarians and the authoritarian wannabes. These are the folks who want to be at the very top. Now, they can be tyrannical, political tyrants. In our society, in our time, they tend to be plutocrats. That is, the plutocracy is ruled by the very, very rich, and plutocrats are the guys who are so rich that they sort of quietly call the shots on everything. So the trick, and this is the danger that we're trying to examine in this series, is how might the authoritarians or the authoritarian plutocrats gain an ever stronger hold on society at the expense of everyone else. And here the trick that they use, and this is a political tactic that goes back to ancient times, but it is still a gigantic threat. We're going to try to explore all this. And it also explains why peacebuilding is so key to addressing authoritarian populism and all the related issues. But the divide and conquer strategy of authoritarian and plutocratic wannabes is they want to help divide the society into us versus them factions. There are a lot of deep divisions anyway. But anything they can do to inflame those divisions is to their advantage. And then the trick is that you support and align yourself with one of those factions. And you use your resources to make sure that faction wins. If you align yourself with the losing faction, you don't do very well. So it's a competitive game, and you could lose, but tyrant wannabes are the kind of folks that take risks. And so once your faction has won, then your grateful supporters don't mind if you wind up getting a lion's share of the spoils of that conflict, the resulting wealth of the society. And you can blame all of the problems that might arise on the losing scapegoat faction. You undertake a variety of techniques to hide your corruption. And ultimately, and this is how you solidify power, is that you force swing people. People can't decide which side they're on, but ultimately they got to side with you because you're the winner. And if they side with the loser, they're in big trouble. So you've got these deep divisions that are being exploited by folks who want control over the larger society. Now, the strategy for resisting this, and this you've got to be able to do if we're going to avoid an authoritarian future, is somehow or another you've got to make peace on both the cultural dimension and the distributional dimension with the folks at the lower end of the hierarchy, including a lot of folks in the professional elite. And you've all got to come together and understand that we've got to challenge the authoritarian wannabes. And that's a peace-building problem, because that means that you've got to get folks with deep differences to understand that they also have very important common interests that they've got to act on. And then the last slideshow in this series is going to look at the larger authoritarian threat. This isn't just about Donald Trump. In fact, it's quite likely that Donald Trump is, in the big march of history, going to be a relatively minor player. He just doesn't, a lot of the stories about how, well, I guess I can say incompetent his administration, they're not the sort of thing that a successful authoritarian does. So, but the big issue, and this is a really excellent article that I recommend. A lot of articles we'll recommend in the course of these posts. Why Technology Favors Tyranny. And in the 20th century, authoritarian regimes lost out to democracies because they weren't such efficient forms of social organization. In the 21st century, using high technology information systems, that might change. And this makes a very persuasive argument that the democracy is very much at risk because of technology. And if we don't get a handle on it, we're in real trouble. And finally, this is a picture of my son and my two grandkids. I'm sure you have people that you care about, especially young people. The truth is, everything, their future, depends on finding a solution to all of this. And if we succeed, they'll have a bright future. If we don't, they won't. So we got to work on it.